Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 207 of Land and Lip. How the Habsburgs got their chin, which is also episode 5 of season 11, The Fall and Rise of the House of Habsburg. The Habsburgs ruled half of Europe with a chin that entered the room 5 minutes before they did. That is one of those witticisms that made the 19th century so amusing. But by that time, the Habsburg Jaw had long receded. It had its heyday in the 16th and 17th century, when the people in Spain called out to the future Emperor Charles V, "Your Majesty, please shut your mouth. The flies of this country are very insolent." And when they looked at his later descendant, King Charles II, who was probably the worst affected, they said, well, he was more Habsburg than human. But where is that famous Habsburg Jaw from? The view repeated again and again in the history books is that it came from Cymburga of Masovia, the wife of Duke Ernst the Iron. But was she really responsible? Or was it something quite different that caused that deformation? And what has that all to do with the prostration of Duke Friedrich IV before Emperor Sigismund in 1415? That is what we're looking at in this episode. But before we start, just the usual handing round of the begging bowl. I guess you know the drill by now, but if you are still listening, maybe you feel it is time to make a contribution to the continued existence of the show, free of advertising. And if you do, go to historyofthegermans.com/support and choose one of the various options. And do not get confused when the software asks you for your account details, even if you come here for the first time. I do not quite understand why it asks you in this way, but what it's trying to do is to get you to open an account by providing an email and a password so that you can access the bonus episodes and the forum. And special thanks go to Morera, Edward B., Derek C., Derek Edmondson, Barry J.R., Joachim B., Lonin J., Steve, and Stephen C., who've already signed up. And with that, back to the show. Last week, we ended with Archduke Friedrich IV, Count of Tyrol, kneeling before Emperor Sigismund and begging to be readmitted to his grace. The kneeling was certainly humiliating, but the other conditions of his pardon were threatening the viability of the whole Habsburg project. Friedrich had to surrender all of his lands to the crown, keeping only those that Sigismund would choose to return to him as a fief. And that return of the land Sigismund had made dependent upon Friedrich standing trial in Constance for his treason and for any other claim anyone else might be bringing. In other words, the chance that Friedrich would be stripped of all his lands for good was still quite high. It is in this period that Friedrich IV gained his nickname, Friedel mit der leeren Tasche, Friedrich with the empty pockets. A loss of his lands, in particular of the Tyrol, would have significantly altered the Habsburg trajectory, because of the silver mines of Schwarz. This mother of all mines grew to be the largest industrial complex in Europe, where 10,000 miners dug up silver ore, silver that acted as collateral for the immense loans granted by Jakob Fugger and others, which in turn funded the Burgundian Wars of Maximilian and the election of Charles V as emperor. In other words, without the Tyrol, no loans, no Spanish Netherlands, and hence no Habsburg Empire. The fate of the Habsburg family hung in the balance. The one who put his considerable weight onto the scales was Ernst the Iron, Duke of Styria, Carinthia and Carniola, and brother of Friedrich IV. Upon news of Friedrich's surrender, he popped up in Meran and began organizing the resistance, and maybe his own takeover of the county. Friedrich had to decide. He could stay in Constance and bet on Sigismund's mercy, or he could flee to Tyrol, bring the wrath of the emperor, an excommunication by the council, and an invading army of princes down on his head. William Cox described Friedrich's situation in Constance as follows, quote, "Meanwhile, Friedrich was detained at Constance, where he was treated like a culprit, and watched like a prisoner. He was brought into the courts of justice to answer all the complaints which were preferred against him. He was repeatedly excommunicated by the Bishop of Trent for not restoring the dominions of that see, and threatened with still severer punishment by the council. He was deserted by all, avoided as a heretic and a traitor, reduced to want, and deprived of all necessities of life. Malicious reports were industriously circulated that he engaged in plots to assassinate Sigismund, and menaces were not withheld that he was destined to become a sacrifice to public justice." End quote. Okay, so the imperial mercy option looks distinctly unpromising. Friedrich had to go for option 2. On March 1st, 1416, he fled from Constance and returned to Tyrol via Feldkirch and the Arlberg Pass. When he arrived in Tyrol, he was warmly greeted by the estates of the county, which must have come as a great relief for Friedrich. Friend of the podcast, Aeneas Silvio Piccolomini, in his gossipy biography, reports why Friedrich was popular with the common people. Quote, "He would often change his dress and visit taverns and farmers unrecognized. There he inquired, as if a stranger, what they thought about the country's government, and asked much about the dukes, the barons, and the prince, and when he heard them praise the prince and criticize the barons, he was glad that he enjoyed the people's favor." End quote. His subjects seemingly preferred him to the Emperor Sigismund. They preferred him to a Bavarian duke. They preferred him to his brother Ernst. The only thing they did not prefer him to was death. So, despite his jubilant reception in Meran and Ernst's subsequent withdrawal back to Styria, Friedrich was by no means out of the woods yet. If Sigismund could muster an army and go down to Tyrol, his vassals may not be as supportive as they appeared right now. His barons may rise up after all. Sigismund tried to encourage them to do exactly that. He even kept dangling the carrot of imperial immediacy before them, if only they would help him toppling this obstinate Count of Tyrol and deliver him to Constance. Throughout 1416, 17 and 18, Sigismund was trying to put together a force that could make an attempt at the topographically challenging Tyrol. He called on the Swiss Confederation, the German cities, the Dukes of Bavaria, the Counts Palatine, even his friend and protégé Friedrich of Hohenzollern, who he had just made Margrave of Brandenburg. But they all turned him down. The Swiss had already got what they wanted when they had taken the Aargau. The German cities had lost confidence in the constantly cash-strapped emperor. Duke Ludwig the Bearded of Bavaria was disappointed when Sigismund first denied him satisfaction against his cousin, who had, after all, tried to smash his head in, and then had passed him over when it came to the awarding of the Margraviate of Brandenburg. All that you can find in episode 172. And the imperial princes, finally, they could not see much benefit in helping Sigismund expanding his empire through the acquisition of Tyrol. And on top of that, Sigismund had dozens of other matters to attend to: the 2 remaining renegade popes, the fallout from the Teutonic Knights' defeat at Tannenberg, issues in Hungary, a marital crisis, money problems, etc., etc., pp. Sigismund was always frazzled, but never more so than during this period. And so in 1418, at the behest of the newly elected Pope Martin V, and under pressure of the mounting tensions in Bohemia following the trial and execution of Jan Hus, episode 174, Sigismund made peace with Friedrich IV. They met in Merseburg on Lake Constance and hashed out a deal. And as always with Sigismund, when he realized his political options were exhausted, well, he sold out. So, for the trifling sum of 50,000 florins, Friedrich was re-enfeoffed with the Tyrol. And he was given permission to pay out any of the other princes who had taken over his lands in 1415. Now, despite the vast amounts of silver coming out of the Schwarz mine, it took Friedrich a decade plus to get all his former possessions back. Well, except for one, the Aargau. The ancient homeland of his family was not for sale. The Swiss Confederation could not be bought. The castle of the Hawk would never return into the family. All they kept was the name. Friedrich IV ruled for another 21 years, and whilst he could not shake his nickname as Friedrich of the Empty Pocket, he became again one of the richest princes in the empire. And that wealth came obviously in part from the mines, but also from the fundamental changes he implemented in his lands. Piccolomini had noted that when Friedrich took charge of Tyrol, the country was ruled by the barons, and he had, quote, no power by himself, and he grew tired of it and wanted to change things. Before Friedrich IV moved to Meran, there had not been a continued presence of a Habsburg in Tyrol. And so, as so often, the constant shortage of cash compelled the princely rulers to mortgage their rights and lands to the local aristocrats, and ultimately they left the management of the county entirely to them. So in his first year as count, Friedrich established a register of ducal rights in Tyrol. He hired administrators who began collecting on these rights, whilst his accountants kept track of money coming in and money going out. Friedrich moved the centre of the princely administration from Meran to Innsbruck, where he established the Neuer Hof, which became the residence for the duke and the permanent seat of the government. Innsbruck was a strategically better location, in particular because it was at the intersection of the east-west route between Austria and the ancestral lands on the Upper Rhine, and on the north-south route across the Brenner Pass. And most importantly, Innsbruck is just 30 kilometers from the silver mines of Schwarz. Friedrich did not limit his activities to just enforcing or buying back of his existing rights. He also tried to actively expand them. And for that, he used the Privilegium Maius, that forged list of ancient rights and titles his uncle Rudolf the Founder had bestowed on the family. And these rights were far-reaching and in many ways unprecedented. They included, amongst other things, a ban on any man within the geographic boundaries of the county to hold immediacy, aka report directly to the emperor. Further, all law courts were subordinate to the duke, and so was the authority of the forests and game and that over water and woods. And whatever the duke shall ordain or command in his lands and regions may not be changed in any manner, in any way, or at any future time by the emperor or any other authority. And then, best of all, these provisions were supposed to apply not just to Austria, but in any territory the House of Austria had already or would in the future acquire. Now sure, we all know it was all made up, but then Friedrich IV made these provisions a reality in Tyrol. The people most upset about these policies were the Tyrolean barons. They formed noble societies intended to oppose these changes. Friedrich then neutralized the societies by asking to become a member himself, a demand these aristocrats could hardly refuse. The most powerful of these barons, Heinrich von Rottenburg, whose inherited title of Hofmeister had made his family the de facto rulers of Tyrol, kept the feud going. He called upon Duke Stefan of Lower Bavaria and the Bishop of Trient to help him put Friedrich back into his box. Now this Lord of Rottenburg was a tough nut, and a famous duelist who had killed many men, and according to Piccolomini, had a coffin with lighted candles carried with him at all times as a courtesy to his victims. Still, the Duke prevailed, mainly because he could rely on the support of his estates, specifically the cities and the gentry, who were tired of the abuse by the constantly feuding barons. Rottenburg surrendered in 1410, and 6 months later he was dead. Whether he was put in his travel coffin, well, we'll never know. This success did much for the reputation of Friedrich, which may explain why he was so enthusiastically received when he returned from his ill-fated adventure in Constance. But then, in 1419, the most serious of these baronial revolts kicked off. The lords of Starkenberg, of Spauer, the family of Oswald von Wolkenstein, ably supported by the Bishop of Trient and the condottiere Pandolfo Malatesta, attacked Friedrich's castles. Friedrich managed to withstand the first wave of attack, and then, through a combination of diplomacy, legal action, and occasional warfare, he managed to break the alliance of the barons. The last of the barons to surrender was Oswald von Wolkenstein, the knight and poet. His life is a truly riveting tale. He had started out as a knight-errant, travelling to Prussia, Russia, Tartary, Turkey, the Near East, the Holy Land, Italy, France, the Black Sea and Aragon. He had gone to Constance with Friedrich IV, but then changed sides and entered service with the Emperor Sigismund. He was sent to England on a diplomatic mission. He was in Perpignan helping to bring the anti-pope Pedro da Luna to resign. He went on crusade in North Africa. And back home, he feuded with his peers. One of these feuds went horribly wrong. He was captured by his opponent and then extensively tortured, before ending up in one of Friedrich IV's prisons. His poetry ranges from tales of his travels, much self-deprecation, a heavy dose of sex mixed with religious poetry and love letters to his wife, as well as pure joie de vivre. And he used his gift to have a go at Friedrich. Here's one of his complaints. I complain of the day that I first gave my faith to a lord who keeps empty hands. Though I served him long and well, I find no thanks, no reward, only sorrow, hunger, and grief. He calls himself duke, yet leaves his men in want. Truly he is poor in purse and poorer in heart. This is probably the oldest reference to Friedrich IV as being penniless. I thought about creating a whole episode on Oswald von Wolkenstein, but I think we need to press on with the story now. Maybe we can do it as a bonus episode if you guys want me to. But now back to Friedrich IV. Our friend Silvio Aeneas Piccolomini summarized his other feats and qualities as follows, quote, he took a wife from the house of Braunschweig. She bore him a son whom she wanted to be named Sigismund, aka he probably didn't. Further, Friedrich was a man of great sexual appetites and had affairs both with married women and married men, but mostly with maidservants. He loved money and therefore he never wanted to fight the Venetians since they assisted him financially. End quote. We will get back to Friedrich IV in a moment, but first we need to talk about his older brother, Ernst the Iron, and his wife Cymburga of Masovia, and the reason you probably pressed play on this episode, the famous Habsburg Jaw. The reason we talk about this now is that the eldest son of Ernst was the first of the Habsburg who is confirmed to have presented that famous feature. Just have a look at the episode artwork. And based on a long tradition, last repeated by Andrew Wheatcroft, the son had, quote, inherited his most striking characteristic, a flat and ponderous lower lip, from his mother. Now, this mother, Cymburga of Masovia, could probably take it. She was by most accounts a strong woman, as in strong enough to bend horseshoes and drive nails into walls with her bare hands. So a most suitable companion for a duke who went by the name of Ernst the Iron, even though others called him the little robber with a giant beard. But did she really bring this world-renowned trait into the family? And before we go there, let's just define what exactly is the Habsburg jaw. It is a hereditary deformation whereby the lower jaw outgrows the upper jaw, resulting in an extended chin and a crossbite. This mandibular prognatism is the result not of just one genetic mutation that then Mendel threw, but multiple genes that add up together to create a particular trait. So to get all these genes in the right order requires a seriously intense level of inbreeding, which is why these conditions are fairly rare. And in the case of the Habsburgs, there are some additional features like the pointy nose, the thick lips and the droopy eyes, all of similar provenance, aka requiring multiple genes to act in concert. Now these features vary in degree and become ever more pronounced throughout the 16th and 17th century until we hit Charles II of Spain, who was so deeply affected he could neither speak nor chew. So, let's take a look at the alleged culprit, Cymburga. First up, we have no contemporary portrait of her. Polish and Austrian chroniclers who knew her did not mention a protruding jaw. Then there is her genetic inheritance. She was the daughter of the Duke of Masovia, a cadet branch of the Piast family, the kings of Poland. Her mother was the sister of Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania and King of Poland, who had defeated the Teutonic Knights at Tannenberg. There is little chance that her parents had much blood in common, given her mother's family had only recently converted to Christianity and had hence not been suitable marriage material for European royalty. Her father's family had one ancestor with a jawline deformation, Boleslav Rymouth, the King of Poland, who was born in 1086, that's 300 years before Cymburga. It's also not clear whether Rymouth's impairment had been genetic or had been caused by an injury. The Poles are currently undertaking a broad analysis of the DNA of their Piast kings and dukes, none of which had noticed an anomaly linked to mandibular prognatism, though admittedly that is not what they were looking for. These studies are all published in Polish, which is why I had to rely on ChatGPT to see whether there was anything in it, a notoriously unreliable source, so if any of you can read Polish and can have a look, it would be much appreciated. So let's add this all together. Cymburga's parents were not closely related. Second, there is no record of her having the feature. And third, there is no record of anyone in her family having a Habsburg jaw except for an ancestor who lived 300 years earlier. So simply on the basis of probability, Cymburga should not be on top of the list. There were many more likely candidates amongst the Habsburg spouses of the 13th, 14th and 15th century, all of whom came from the closely interrelated community of imperial princes and European royalty. So, why would anyone single out Cymburga? I spent a solid day trying to trace where the first mention of Cymburga as the origin of the Habsburg jaw came from. And this turned into a truly epic and utterly pointless goose chase. I started with Andrew Wheatcroft, who quoted a book by Friedrich IV, which does not contain the claim that Cymburga was the source. Then I looked at William Cox, who made the same allegation. He just referenced authorities with no further detail. Wikipedia then directed me to Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholia of 1621. I have not read the book, but Coleridge, Wordsworth, Herman Melville, Milton, Samuel Johnson, Lawrence Sterne, John Keats and Philip Pullman clearly loved what medical researchers described as that omnigatherum of anecdotes of insanity whose burden was that mankind, including the author himself, was quite out of its mind. So, not a very reliable source, but what's even stranger is that at no point does Robert Burton even mention Cymburga. That did not stop ChatGPT and its ilk to hallucinate a detailed quote from Burton, which again could not be found at the reference they give nor anywhere else. Then Wikipedia further directed me onto The History of Vienna by Wolfgang Latius from the middle of the 16th century. Again, nothing at all about Cymburga and the lip. A run through the digitized content of the Bavarian State Library then brought up more stories about Cymburga, but not once about the Habsburg lip. Instead, the story goes that Duke Ernst had met Cymburga at some event at the court of Emperor Sigismund, and he was so smitten by her extraordinary beauty that he travelled to Krakow in disguise to woo her. In one retelling, he saved her from an attack by a brown bear, which is depicted in a 19th century picture today in the Belvedere. So, unless Ernst had a very strange penchant for chinful women, Cymburga was unlikely to have been afflicted by a deformation of the jaw. There's, however, a conceivable reason in this story that may explain why Cymburga is being blamed. You see, Cymburga and Ernst were both members of the high aristocracy. They were unmarried, and a link between Habsburg and Poland is always politically opportune. So why all this cloak and dagger story and the bear hunting thing? The problem was that Cymburga's existence reminded the family of another humiliation. Ernst's older brother Wilhelm had been engaged to Hedwig, the daughter of King Louis of Hungary and Poland. and Hedwig is better known to posterity as Jadwiga, the girl who was made King of Poland in 1384. Now, Wilhelm and Jadwiga were engaged and were apparently very close. She had lived in Austria as a child. But in the complex negotiations that followed her father's death, the Polish estates decided that the engagement to Wilhelm should be set aside and that Jadwiga should marry Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, instead. Jogaila, who was Cymburga's uncle, then leveraged this marriage into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that dominated much of Central Europe for the coming centuries. Now, we covered that tumultuous process in episode 169. Now, whilst the marriage to Jogaila made sense for the Poles, it was a massive snub to the Habsburgs. Breaking engagements was something a king or emperor could do to a Burggraf of Nuremberg or some Markgraf of Baden, but not to an Archduke of Austria. Well, the Poles had done it, and the Habsburgs could do nothing about it. Cymburga's presence in Vienna was a constant reminder that the Habsburg power was much diminished, and making her extremely unpopular with the family. So, if you look for a reason why she might have been singled out as the source of the Habsburg Jaw, well, that may be it. But then again, nobody seems to have mentioned it until William Cox comes up with it in 1847, and God knows where he got that from. So, if it definitely was not Cymburga, where did the Habsburg Jaw come from then? Well, there is one figure close to the House of Habsburg that had a confirmed deformation of the jaw, and that was the Emperor Sigismund himself. In all his portraits, you can see that he couldn't fully close his mouth anymore, something people had remarked on at the time. But there is no link between Sigismund and the surviving branches of the House of Habsburg, neither downstream from him nor 2 or 3 generations before. Then maybe it was running in the family already for some time. We have 2 depictions of early members of the House of Habsburg that are believed to be genuine portraits. And these are the tomb of Rudolf I from about 1295 and an oil portrait of Rudolf IV, the founder, from the mid-14th century. I'm not sure I can detect anything on Rudolf I, whilst Rudolf IV does look as if he was a mouth breather. But I'm not sure what that is worth. Maybe the explanation is much simpler. The European high aristocracy had settled sometime in the 13th century. Very few new families were able to enter that close circle of intermarried princes. Sure, there were the Italians, the Visconti of Milan, the Medici of Florence, and the Lithuanians and Russians, but most of the rest was basically the same set of cousins twice removed that made up the rather limited gene pool. And with the rather limited gene pool came the occasional deformations, as we have seen with Sigismund and maybe Rudolf IV. What tightened the pool further and may have given rise to the most prominent feature was that constant intermarriage between the Spanish and the Austrian branches during the 16th and 17th century. And why did they constantly intermarry? Did they not know about the impact of inbreeding? Oh, sure they knew about this. This is an agricultural society where everyone understands what happens if a herd is left without fresh blood, and there are all these strict rules of the church about consanguinity. But these marriages between often first cousins were a political necessity. Charles V had divided the Habsburg Empire into 2 parts, the Austrian and the Spanish line, and so to keep the 2 parts of the empire acting in unison, the Habsburgs needed to renew the familial link at least every 2nd generation, leading to a truly catastrophic level of inbreeding. Only when Spain was lost to the Bourbons, the need for these intermarriages disappeared, and with it, the Habsburg Jaw. Maria Theresia had no visible prognatism, nor had her children, in particular not Marie Antoinette, though French revolutionary propaganda kept adding that feature to her depictions. In other words, the Habsburg Jaw was the result of politics, of a fear that the coherence of the family could fall apart. And that fear of a breakup of the family goes way back to the times we talk about right now. Which also gets us back to Ernst the Iron. Now, Ernst the Iron was last seen taking over the Tyrol whilst his brother was literally tied up in Constance. and when Friedrich reappeared in 1415, Ernst returned to Styria without making a fuss. That is quite a remarkable change of pattern. In the years before, he had fought fiercely with his brother Leopold over control of the Duchy of Austria, and he had later on conspired with the barons of Tyrol to oust his younger brother. But now, at a time when Friedrich was on more than shaky ground, he didn't pounce. Now, we do not know what had happened to him. He had done a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1414, where he was knighted as a member of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre, and as such he had to commit to a number of religious observances, maybe even the 10 Commandments, which have this clause about not coveting your neighbor's house, fields, man, maidservant, or even ass, or anything else. But then I wonder whether there isn't something more. The shock of seeing his brother and hence his family kneeling before Sigismund may have triggered his change of heart. Because had the family been united, Sigismund would have never gotten away with humiliating a senior member of the Habsburgs. Friedrich and Ernst were both powerful princes, and their cousin Albrecht V was equally rich and a very close ally of Sigismund. By not protesting against Friedrich's ban and its execution, they had made it possible. And when a year later at least Friedrich and Ernst stood together, then Sigismund stood no longer any chance of invading Tyrol. The entente between the brothers seemed to have continued once the Tyrol was stabilized, and when Ernst died in 1424, his two sons, Friedrich and Albrecht, were placed under the guardianship of Friedrich IV, and in turn, when Friedrich IV died, his former ward took over the guardianship of his son, the 12-year-old Sigismund. So after all, the kneeling before the emperor, painful as it certainly was, had a silver lining, inasmuch as it shocked the Habsburgs out of their internecine warfare into finding a way to act more coherently. We are still a long way from the point when they are sacrificing their health and appearance for the sake of family coherence, and this is certainly not yet the last war between the brothers, but the understanding is about to set in that they can either rule together or be dragged under, divided. And finally, one member of the family has taken very much a back seat in this episode, and that is Ernst and Friedrich's second cousin, the Duke Albrecht V of Austria. Now he is the one who will truly restore the fortunes of the family, bring them back to the top table. Ironically, courtesy of the man who had just humiliated them so thoroughly. And that's, however, something we will have to discuss next week. I hope you will join us again. And if you find all of this worth supporting, go to historyofthegermans.com/support, where you can find various options to keep this show on the road and advertising free.